evening. So I wanted to find something a little bit Christmassy. And I kind of struggled to find some good Christmassy ghost stories. There's some I'm saving for a little bit nearer Christmas. But my mind kept going back to the story of the Mistletoe Bough bride, which is kind of a famous English haunting. And I wanted to read this account of the haunting, and there's a poem I might read afterwards, which is actually, obviously it fits in with it's about the haunting. So yeah, something a bit different. It's not a ghost fictional narrative, but it's still interesting. The wedding dress on the skeleton, its once delicately embroidered white satin, now yellowed and brittled with age, crumbled into dust at a touch. The plain gold ring on the third finger of one bony hand had long since lost its lustre. Beneath the other hand, still clasped in the now fleshless fingers, was the sprig of mistletoe that the young bride had coquettishly carried with her when she'd hidden in the chest on that fateful day so long before. Mistletoe to grant the first young man who would find her a kiss on the lips. But the mistletoe withered and decayed, as she did, that lovely teenage bride inside her oaken prison. For no one found her. Full 50 years passed, it said, before the chest was opened, and its grim contents solved a still-remembered mystery of a tragic wedding day and a disappearing bride. Who was she? The famous Mistletoe Bough bride, whose sad-eyed ghost is said to have been seen on many occasions at Brampshill House in Hartley, Wintney in Hampshire. That's where the famous oak chest is now kept. The Victorian dramatist and songwriter Thomas Haynes Bailey placed the macabre tale very firmly in England in his poem The Mistletoe Bough, published in 1828. But it's generally accepted now that he based this on a poem by Samuel Rogers, who had appeared some years before, and Rogers had come across the story whilst travelling in Italy. He maintained that the tragic bride was Ginevra Orsini, who lived with a rich widowed father at Modena in the 18th century. In the lustre of her youth and beauty, to quote Rogers, at just 15, she became the bride of Francesco Doria. Imagine the scene that day in 1727 at the Orsini Palace, with its huge hall bedecked with holly and mistletoe, as well as the usual wedding decorations. For the happy pair had chosen to be married on Christmas Day. There was double cause for festivity and celebration. Logs were blazing in the fire. Ginevra's father and other older guests, drowsy with wine and overeating, were nodding off, despite the musicians' unflagging efforts. But the bride was young and in a merry mood. She suggested a game of hide and seek, and dashed from the room with the sprig of mistletoe in her hand. What possessed her to use that huge, exquisitely carved oak chest in a remote part of the palace as a hiding place? Once inside, the spring lock snapped shut, imprisoning her in what was to become a coffin of her own choosing. For in spite of the frenzied hammering of her fists on the inside of the chest, its thick walls muffled the sound. In vain, her frantic husband, her father, and the wedding guests searched for the missing girl. For hours. Then days, until, distraught with empty hearts, father and husband had to accept she was gone. Half a century passed with the mystery unsolved. Then the housekeeper to some new occupants of the palace came across the dust-covered chest and forced it open. Lifting the lid, she recoiled with horror at the skeleton of the girl, still clad in her mouldering wedding dress. With here and there, wrote Samuel Rogers, a pearl, an emerald, a stone, a golden clasp holding a shred of gold. All else had perished, save a wedding ring and a small seal, engraven with a name, Ginevra. So can the chest at Bramshill House, a lovely Jacobean mansion in the depths of the typical English countryside, really be that same one from 18th century Italy? Remarkably, it seems so. For experts say the Bramshill chest is certainly over 250 years old. It's also Italian, with 18th century Italian style paintings in excellent condition inside the lid, and beautifully executed carvings of satyrs and animals on the outside. It also has a spring lock that cannot be opened from inside the chest. Bramshill House is now a police training establishment for high-ranking officers. Daphne Ruddiman, the librarian there, said, "It seems likely that when Bramshill was owned by the Cope family some years ago, the chest was brought here by the 5th Baronet. He certainly lived for some time in Italy and brought back a number of articles and pieces of furniture when he returned home. It also seems that the ghost of poor Ginevra Orsini came with the chest in which she died such a horrific death. For over the years, including recently, there have been a number of claims by various people to have seen the spectre of a sad girl in a white dress in its vicinity in the hall. Shortly after World War II, King Michael and Queen Maria of Romania and their children lived for a while at Bramshill, and they all claimed to have seen the ghost at various times. In fact, the Queen became so worried when her children talked of the lady in white who passed through their bedroom without opening the door that she had them moved into another room. Then she herself saw a beautiful young woman with a sad face, sitting in a chair when she thought she was alone in the room. When she spoke to her, the figure just faded and disappeared. A footman, far from being scared of the apparition, even tried to come to grips with it. He reported that when he awoke one night and saw the white lady standing by his bed, he quickly jumped out and tried to embrace her. He maintained, "She simply dissolved in my arms, leaving a strong smell of flowers behind." This smell of flowers is associated with the ghost and is constantly being mentioned in reports, said Mrs. Ruddiman. It's usually described as like the scent of lily of the valley. I've smelt it myself. On my very first day here a few months ago, as I was being shown around, I remember distinctly smelling a fragrant floral perfume. I knew nothing about the lady in white at the time. It was only afterwards, when I learned of a lingering lily of the valley scent, that it had any significance for me. Some people have told me they have walked into the house in midwinter and have been mystified to detect lily of the valley hanging in the air. There have been a number of reports of inexplicable sudden drops in temperature too, especially around the area of the bridal chest. Among the most recent people actually to see the ghost was a senior policeman. He admitted that he stood up chilled with fright, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, when the phantom stood staring at him for a few seconds before fading into mist and disappearing. Another was Bramshill security guard Bill Pearce. He was on duty alone in the hall and within the sight of the chest one night a few weeks ago, when the sudden whiff of perfume made him look up. She was standing by the chest, about 10 yards away from me, he recalled. She wasn't solid, but you could actually see through her. She was a young woman, dressed in a long white gown, and with an air of unhappiness. I don't remember being afraid of her. We just looked at each other for a minute or two. I was quite disappointed when a colleague suddenly came in, and she quickly faded and disappeared. So can a ghost last for 250 years? Can a ghost travel across continents far from its place of death? It's said that the most persistent ghosts are those of people whose ends have been particularly violent, traumatic, or horrific. Few deaths can have been so horrifying as that of 15-year-old Ginevra Orsini, trapped alive in that oaken chest, beating frantically on its sides until her hands were bruised and bloody, screaming for a husband who never came. Perhaps it is no surprise that her poor sad phantom still haunts the spot on which the chest now stands. After 2.5 centuries, it seems the ghost of the Mistletoe Bough bride is still forever searching for a bridegroom who long ago went sorrowfully to a grave of his own. So that's the story, the very sad story and slightly creepy story of the Mistletoe Bough bride. And I've actually got Thomas Haynes Bailey's poem that he wrote about the Mistletoe Bough bride. The mistletoe hung in the castle hall, the holly branch shone on the old oak wall, and the baron's retainers were blithe and gay, and keeping their Christmas holy day. The baron beheld with a father's pride his beautiful child, young Lovell's bride, while she with her bright eyes seemed to be the star of godly company. "I'm weary of dancing now," she cried. "Here, tarry a moment, I'll hide. And Lovell, be sure thou'rt first to trace the clue to my secret hiding place." Away she ran, and her friends began each tower to search, each nook to scan. And young Lovell cried, "Oh, where dost thou hide? I'm lonesome without thee, my own dear bride." They sought her that night, they sought her next day, and they sought her in vain when a week passed away. In the highest, the lowest, the loneliest spot, young Lovell sought wildly, but found her not. And years flew by, and their grief at last was told as a sorrowful tale long past. And when Lovell appeared, the children cried, "See, the old man weeps for his fairy bride." At length an old oak chest that had long lain hid was found in the castle. They raised the lid, and a skeleton form lay mouldering there in the bridal wreath of the lady fair. How sad was her fate! In sportive jest she hid from her lord in the old oak chest. It closed with a spring, and her bridal bloom lay withering there in a living tomb. Thank you for joining me. Next week it's an actual spooky story, I promise. Stay safe.